Good. How are you all today? About, and then we'll start with a few like questions, do a little bit of a reading, and then open it up for all of you guys and any questions you guys might have. What do you guys think about that? Awesome. All right. So about Lizna. Lizna wrote letters to my brown mother to start conversations about mental health in the South Asian diaspora and to encourage open, authentic communication in South Asian communities. As the first generation Pakistani American herself, Abbas understands the relationship between mental health and culture firsthand. Her interviews, as you will see throughout the book if you haven't read it yet, affirm this shared experience. She contextualizes and critiques her community while completing her dual master's degree, which is really impressive, by the way. You wrote a whole book while doing her master's. Round of applause for that. Like studying a book. Her dual master's degrees were in business and foreign services at Georgetown University. And then during her free time, she also enjoyed reading, dabbling in photography, cooking Pakistani dishes, and exploring Washington, D.C. with her dog, Baxter. So that's a little bit about her as a summary. A little bit about the book. So I'm sure you guys have all seen this beautifully illustrated book that is around the room. In this book, Lizna Abbas examines historical events, migration patterns, and cultural communities to understand why South Asian migrants fail to adequately address mental health. I'm sure we're all aware, like across the board, the taboo that's placed on mental health. So this book really brings that forward. She shows how culture, gender, and religion intersect to impact immigrants and their posterity. Abbas not only offers facts and figures, but personifies the mental health crisis through different walks of life, including a queer adult to his younger self and a young woman in a toxic marriage. The book accumulates in a call to action by offering readers advice to seeking culturally sensitive therapy, self-care practices, and imperative conversations. Letters to My Grandmother includes heart-wrenching anecdotes and soulful descriptions that promise to educate and hopefully change the South Asian community for the better. So let's give a round of applause again. So that was a quick summary of who Lizna is. Personally, I actually became friends with her because of this book. I follow a South Asian writing community. I was actually one of the admins of the Facebook group that we created, Subtle Curtain Writers, as one of the founding admins, and we like to feature different authors from the South Asian diaspora. And we came across this book because it was a novel project, and we supported it, saw her through the process of writing, publishing, all of that, and then we were really excited for it to come out, and then it finally did, and I can say that it was one of the most heart-wrenching, but also like in the best ways, books that I have ever read. And it hit, like there were points in the book that I was just like, yes, and this, I wish I could say this way. I don't know if any of you who read that felt that as well as you turned the pages. But I reached out to her through her email, and I was like, hey, I don't know if this is weird, but like, would you like to grab coffee or something? I would love to pick your brain about this book. And we did, and that's kind of how we ended up where we are today. So just wanted to share that. So
and that offer stands for anybody else here as well.
So, all right, so we'll just dive into a couple of different questions because I'm sure you guys are curious a little bit about the writing, what's written in it, how she came to it, and whatnot. So to start off, put you on the spot. Why has mental health been a taboo topic in the South Asian diaspora, and how has this shaped your own experience?
That's a great question. First of all, I just want to say thank you, everybody, to all of you who came out and those who are watching via the live stream. Really excited to finally get some momentum going and have these events, talk to people about this super important topic that doesn't often get talked about. In response to the question, I think some of the main reasons that we have a taboo comes down a lot to our culture. The culture, which is a collectivist culture where the family unit is at the center of the culture instead of an individualistic culture, which is American culture, where the individual is at the center of the culture. In a collectivist culture, it often becomes very, very difficult to prioritize yourself. And you are not you, you are who you are in relation to other people. You are someone's mother, you're someone's brother, you're someone's aunt, someone's daughter. You're not just you. And because of that, there's a lot of mental health issues that can arise when you're not really able to understand yourself or who you are, understand your identity. And so when we have these mental health issues that may arise, it also becomes hard to address that because in a collectivist culture where the family unit is at the center, there's a lot of emphasis placed on respect, on what people perceive from the outside. So often, I talk a lot about this phrase called "log kya kahenge," which means what will people say, and that becomes the biggest barrier to prioritizing your mental health in a collectivist culture. And because of that, often people who don't even understand what they're experiencing, which was similar to my experience, and if you're not really understanding the mental health struggle or crisis that you're going through, you're not really comfortable enough to speak out about it. And so then you're suffering in silence without really understanding what's going on. And that just perpetuates. And I would say that perpetuated in the last generations. So my parents and my grandparents, and they went through it without knowing what was going on. That's just a part of life. And they're not really able to get any of those underlying issues addressed. And that ends up causing a sort of ripple effect, generational trauma, as it's sometimes called.
I would 100% agree with that. And I know with what you're saying is very applicable to, of course, the South Asian diaspora that we mentioned, but it's also applicable to a lot of cultures across the board. I mean, that whole immigration influx that came in, at least to the West, right? Everybody had their own assimilation challenges, their own understanding challenges. So I think you hit it on the dot when you were talking about understanding both the individualistic, but also understanding how you fit into that larger community. So thank you for that. All right. What inspired you to embark on the journey of writing this book?
Yeah, so I wrote this book for 18-year-old me who left the doctor's office being diagnosed with major depressive disorder, not knowing what that meant, thinking this is the end for me, like it's over, life is not going to be good again, and not really understanding how to navigate that. There was nobody that I grew up around who ever spoke about mental health. That my parents didn't understand it, and if you talked about mental health, maybe we saw it on TV, but those people were getting made fun of for being crazy or hallucinating or hysterical, whatever it was. And so there was no positive association with what it meant to have depression or struggling with mental health, anxiety, anything. So with that, when I kind of had the opportunity to write this book, I knew that this was a topic I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about this for myself, but also for my siblings that are younger than me, so that I could sort of tell them, like, it's okay if you've ever felt this way, and it will get better. And this is the reasons that I've found that has helped me. This is one of the reasons that I have found to help me move forward with it, to come to terms with it. And so writing this book really helped me do that. And the second reason would be when I had this idea, I started talking to people about this idea, like I'm going to write this book, and every single person that I talked to was like, oh, this is not a topic anybody's talking about. This was around June 2020, so right when the pandemic was starting. A lot of people were like, yeah, we talk about mental health at work and this and that, but not in the context of being South Asian or being an immigrant. So this was a conversation I realized throughout my interviews that was necessary to have, and it wasn't being had. So those are some of the reasons that I decided to write this book.
I think another thing that you just hit on is that idea of crazy, right? That idea of pagal, if you've ever heard that term used before. You're either pagal or you're normal. to understand that we all have feelings, right? I mean, the simplest thing, what our favorite color is, it sparks a certain level of joy, which is a feeling, right? To understand those levels is absolutely important. So I'm really glad that you took that journey and tried to do something that could impact a wider audience, even if that wasn't necessarily your intention.
Yeah.
All right. What are some of the cultural themes you became more aware of through your research that further deepened the stigma towards mental health in the basic communities?
So I started this journey from the perspective of a Pakistani American woman. There's a lot that I have experienced, but there was a lot that I didn't know. And that's why I found it very important to interview people. I interviewed about 50 to 60 South Asians from different walks of life, different ages. Some people I knew, some people I was just connected to and didn't know at all. And that allowed me to get multiple perspectives on the issue at hand and how it was dealt with. In my interviews, there were some folks who had great experiences. You know, one of the questions I would ask was, did your parents ever bring up mental health when you were younger? And some people were like, yeah, they did. We talked about it. It was addressed. And then some people were, told me, similar to my experience, that this was nothing that they ever had heard of before coming to maybe college. This was not something that was addressed in their household. And even if it was from that lens of what you would see in a Bollywood movie, somebody going crazy. And so I talked about my own experience, but when I was doing these interviews, I was able to get all these different experiences that I really didn't have any insight on. And so having these interviews, I was able to get a deeper look on those. So I talked about toxic masculinity. I have a father, but I don't have any brothers. So the lens with which I saw toxic masculinity was very limited. I talked about queerness in the LGBT community. It's not a community I'm from, but it's a community I know that is very important to talk about and to learn about. So I reached out, found some folks that identified with that community, that experience. I interviewed mothers. I interviewed people that were like my parents' age. I interviewed people that were in college, people that were my age, and really got a perspective from people that immigrated here, that weren't born here. All of those different experiences relating to mental health really helped shape the book for what it is today.
Thank you for that.
You guys can hear me fine, right? Okay.
Awesome. To follow up on that a little bit, was it hard for you to pick out which of those interviews you wanted to include in the book?
Actually, no, because the way I ended up structuring the book was that these letters that are in the book that start every chapter are anonymous. And the reason they're anonymous is when I interviewed these people, I promised them that I would love to hear your story, but I won't associate your story with your name. So I was able to get such deep level of insight from these people because of that anonymity that I had promised them. And what that allowed me to do was pull in all of these different people's experiences into one letter. So I was able to kind of include sort of quotes from every single person, directly or indirectly, that I had interviewed. And I was really glad that I was able to do that because there was just so many things that I wanted to talk about. When I was outlining, I was like, oh, I could do this in the second version because there's just so many more topics that come to hand. So I was really glad I was able to include all of their perspectives within that.
Thank you for that. And then the last question before I open it up to a sample reading is, what was your favorite part about writing this book? So we talked a little bit about the challenges and the process, but what was your favorite part?
My favorite part was, I would say, the interviews and then talking to my parents about this book. So I had brought up mental health when I was younger, going through my issues, but after that, I didn't really talk about it. When I started when I had this idea for this book, told my family, they were a little bit unsure. They're like, why, you can't think of anything else to write about? Like, why do you want to write about this? I was like, no, this is what I want to do. And every time I would call them, and my interviews lasted about 3 to 4 months was the process of me interviewing. Every time I called them, they would actually ask, like, oh, like, did you interview somebody? Like, how did that go? So I would tell them what I learned. And over time, that 4 or 5 months, I noticed a perception shift from them. Like, they had a different perspective on it. They were curious about it. They were excited to hear about it. And that, I think, was a great kind of little added bonus to this whole process.
It's really inspiring me to see, like, as you go through this process, how that mindset shift changes, right? And you saw that directly with your parents.
Exactly.
So I think there's hope for everybody with that example right there. So, all right, that's the few, feelers for now. If you so inclined, to start giving us a little sample taste of your book, so we all know what we're headed in for. If you haven't read it yet, if you had. We'll just reliving the greatest hits.
So I have a few snippets that I'm going to read from different parts of the book. The first one is from the chapter titled "Log Kya Kahenge," which means "What will people say?" One caveat, so throughout the book I use terms from Urdu, which is my native language, and I will be sure to translate them as I go. So if there's something you hear that you don't understand, the translation is coming. Alright. Log kya kahenge? What will people say? This mantra is etched so deeply into our minds that we don't even need our parents to ask us this question anymore. We do it ourselves. In our culture, our lives are dictated not by us, but rather by what others might think of us. But log kya kahenge, what will people say, isn't actually the inquiry it appears to be. At best, it's a rhetorical question, not so subtly nudging us to stay in our place. We're reminded that there's already an identity and path chosen for us, one we're forbidden from veering away from. Ironically, there is no question about it. Our parents and society give us an ultimatum based on a certain valued appearance, attitude, and mannerism. This is the only way to be you. You are who I tell you you are. We know best. We're suffocated by this proclamation that controls the gears running our society, where everyone is the judge, jury, and executioner. The morality of outsiders is revered, no matter how unjust they may be. Log kya kahenge is controlled by another name. Our society expects, demands, we do things and behave a certain way, and they're not quiet about it. The communities we're a part of are quick to judge our actions and circumstances without even knowing the full story. Restrictive agency in our own lives. The people run this show, and we're merely their puppets. The puppet masters, then, feel entitled to know the goings-on in every household. They've already stripped away our agency, so they take our privacy as well. Under the guise of Log kya kahenge, the South Asian community around us becomes a sort of big brother. As we try to navigate forming an identity, even if in secret, we must watch out for the surveillance from those around us. If we think our parents aren't watching, some auntie definitely is. We're found to be doing anything other than what is expected of us. We're shamed and guilty about it. We've not only disobeyed our elders, but we've tarnished their reputation of perfection and order. So that was a little snippet. The next part is from the chapter on honor, family honor. This one hits a little close to home. Honor, izzat, is the lens through which many South Asians navigate their realities. It's the highly valuable currency via which status and identity is maintained within our communities. As it's earned, this badge of honor is worn proudly by the men in the family, their heads held up high. But the burden of protecting and guarding this honor is placed solely on the women in society, especially our daughters. The izzat honor of a family is almost entirely dependent on the actions and reputation of the women in the family. Izzat honor is a whip used to shepherd women and girls to follow patriarchal societal expectations. Under the guise of family honor, girls are required to maintain a sober, timid demeanor to be the good daughters. Their behavior is governed in order to ensure their purity and innocence and virginity. Men and boys are seldom required to bear the responsibility of honor with such severe austerity. Even when they do, men lose honor over the fact that they fail to control the women in their family rather than for their own mistakes, which are usually overlooked or minimized. A man's honor is only his, but a woman's honor tarnishes the reputation of entire families. In part, the notion of family honor is so deeply connected to women that the euphemism for rape is izzat lut gayi hai, meaning your honor has been robbed. And because the family izzat honor is always at stake, daughters are considered a liability. To protect their izzat, families impose strict rules on their children, especially their daughters. These rules look different for immigrants than they would have back home, but the goal remains the same: control. On the offensive, parents use shame and guilt to coerce their children into submission. It's considered shameful to not follow the strict norms and values that are in place to supposedly protect us. From a young age, we're painted a picture of what to do. Caution against becoming the women who ruin their family's honor and are exiled for it. The gift of family, community, and love is conditional and only for those who can manage to protect their izzah. The cautionary tales of women who failed to protect their family's honor were our bedtime stories. We knew the drill. All right. I have two more, if that's not too much for you all. That's good? Okay. So this one is from the chapter on toxic masculinity. South Asian gender roles and the patriarchal structure prevent Desi, South Asian men from accessing their emotions in the name of tradition and culture. Along with these constraints, brown men are immediately burdened with the task of being the provider. They can neither shirk this responsibility nor share it with a woman, otherwise their masculinity is doubted. Like Jay mentions to his brother in the letter, which is a part of the book, men aren't allowed to seek help without being considered weak. They must carry the burden of providing for and protecting their families without any space to process the scars that baggage leaves. We see this at home, and it's reinforced on screen. The trope of emotionally unavailable fathers in TV serials and movies is commonly found in our homes. Bollywood never shies away from reminding its viewers that "Mard ko dard nahi hota," means men don't feel real pain. Whether it was Amrish Puri playing a distant, callous father in Dulhania Le Jayenge in the 90s, or Salman Khan using violence to solve his issues in every action movie since the year 2000, boys are constantly taught that there is only one way to be a man. Bollywood's angry young man era, from the 60s to the 90s, which gave us classics such as the movie Sholay, defined masculinity for our fathers and us by glamorizing charismatic heroes as they single-handedly fought off groups of thugs to save their damsels in distress. Our immigrant fathers, equipped with these inherited beliefs, are the toughest men we know. They always held it together, kept their emotions and vulnerabilities in check to avoid being perceived as weak. The only emotions that men are allowed to display are anger and rage, so that's what they do. Unable to channel their emotions in other ways, immigrant fathers are forced to use aggression and anger as their only coping mechanism. Our fathers are angry because that's all they know to be. For them, their masculinity was only practiced through the power and control they could exert over others. What else should we expect from a generation that grew up watching hyper-masculine, angry young men celebrated on screen?
I think that's true for Hollywood too, right?
Yes.
Because you see the insults of, what are you, a girl? Why are you crying, right? Simple here and there things that add up over time.
Exactly. Okay, so I have one last one. This is a real quick one. Finally, I want to say, this book is not meant to demonize our culture. This is my culture, and I love it. I take pride in it. Nevertheless, much of what I say remains critical of our culture. This critique is important and necessary because we can do better. We must do better. If we don't, we will keep driving our own people away from this beautiful culture. There are already so many of us who feel suffocated by the rigidity of our own culture and find it necessary to shun their Desi, South Asian side. If that continues to happen, the South Asian heritage that made us all who we are will slowly become extinct. If our culture keeps harming and hurting the mental health of future generations, more and more people would decide to erase their South Asian identities, and that would be the real shame.
I think that last one definitely hit home with me. I think as a personal story, I definitely struggled a lot with my South Asian identity. So like me in the last couple of years, I've been trying to meet people that weren't forced to be met through the Pakistani masjid or communities or things like that. Where it's like, oh, you need to meet Auntie so and so and then her kids, oh, I don't care who's a doctor. But redefining that and whatnot, I agree 100% because that is a form of power for ourselves as well. It's reclaiming that autonomy and agency and understanding what that culture means for us. So I'm glad you addressed that as well because although we're heavily criticizing mental health and the taboo that's on it in these diaspora communities, we also want to bring forth the beauty of these communities. I mean, the food is awesome. Like, have you had the food? Samosas are lit. But more than that, so just a little bit of a humor change. But with that, thank you so much for sharing and for reading that. Another round of applause, everyone. So at this point, I would like to open it up to you guys. What are some questions that you guys have, things that you guys want to share, any feedback, anything like that? Don't be shy. Yes.
Thanks for sharing those readings. I'm really excited to read the rest of it. I'm curious how members of your community, like your family and your friends, have responded to things, including.
So she was asking how have family and friends responded to this book, and was there more to that?
Yeah, like your parents in particular. I think it's really nice to hear about how they warmed up to the idea of you creating this book. So I'm curious how they feel about it now after reading it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my mom has, I don't think she's read the whole book yet. I think this is a lot. And I started the book talking about my own experience, so I think that's a lot to take in. But from my family back in Pakistan, I told them I was doing this. I didn't expect much of a reaction, but my cousin had the book shipped to her. Second day, she messages me, I can't believe that you wrote all this because this is exactly what I felt throughout most of my life. And that just made me feel like so overwhelmed with like emotion and like excitement. I was just really happy that I was able to give a voice to somebody that felt that they were voiceless. And also to remind them that this is an experience that so many of us are going through, have gone through. You're not alone. And the third thing, the latter half of the book focuses on moving forward, taking care of our mental health via self-care, building boundaries, which is something I still struggle with, going to therapy, having difficult conversations. And I was really excited that I was able to provide some of those tools to people that may not necessarily always come across those tools or feel that some of those things are accessible to them.
So as a marketing plug, I say you all buy one and leave it in random spots so that people just pick it up. Because honestly, it is eye-catching that way. Because sometimes, because of the way the taboo is framed, people don't openly talk about these things, but they may read it and they may internally process. So Pavlov's dog, but brown style.
We have a question from the online community. Did you have a story or account you heard that actually affected your day-to-day life?
That's a good question as well. So I will say that one of the more challenging parts of writing this book was, I said that was one of the best parts, but it was also one of the most challenging parts was going through these interviews. There was a week, I believe I had like 8 or 9 interviews, and I told my friend about it. I was like, this was an emotionally taxing week. Just, I was really grateful that people were willing to be vulnerable, share their stories, talk to me about a lot of the things that they had gone through, but internalizing all of that was pretty emotionally taxing. Every time somebody said something and I was able to relate to it, it was great. It was a good feeling that I was able to relate to it, but it was also hard to sort of relive a lot of those experiences over and over and over again. And I think one of the other things that I learned just from my interviews is that it is so important to share your perspective and your experience with other people because you'll never know that somebody has gone through something if you don't talk about it. One of the people I interviewed was a former coworker of mine. And talking to her day to day at work, I would have never known the extent of all of the things that she was dealing with. But being able to talk to somebody on that level, I was able to kind of get to know them a little bit better, and I thought that was a great thing.
it's almost as if the more we openly share, like with these honest conversations, we come closer together as a community. So I think that is really a powerful perspective to take on why having these conversations is important, like you said.
And personally, what helped my own mental health the most when I was really struggling a lot with depression back in undergrad was telling people about it. I was very open with my friends. I was like, this is something I struggle with. And that helped me come to terms with it, even just verbalizing it. So in the beginning, when I didn't say anything, it was just this growing monster in my head. And when I gave it a name, talked about it, you know, my friends would be like, oh yeah, that's something that I've been through too. I feel that way as well. And we were able to talk about the different strategies on how to take care of ourselves.
I also think it's very brave that you took on reading all these stories and reliving that. So I want to give you a round of applause for that, because that can get really heavy, and we all know how triggers work and stuff. So thank you for doing that and creating this for us.
I was a theater kid, so I think you might hear me. Did you find just put the live stream on. Okay.
Did you find in your own sort of experience with depression or whatever that you looked at your parents in a different light, in maybe one particular parent in a way that was a bit sad, because you could sort of, when you examine some of your own maybe childhood traumas, you realize the intergenerational part, but also if you're lucky, or not lucky, but if you can see your parents still reliving their own in a way, and you can't always help them with that. Did you kind of experience that writing the book, or did you know anyone who was kind of trying to, or encounter anyone who was sort of looking at the cycle and kind of wondering what to do with it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think with that, it was very interesting to do a lot of the research and see the generational trauma like live, analyzing my own life, because you don't really ever sit down and analyze a lot of your life. I threw in some snippets and anecdotes of things that I realized did cause me some like quote unquote trauma, or affected me, changed my behaviors, etc. And I think it was very interesting seeing my parents' journey apart from them just being my parents. I think that's something I talk about in the book as well, is that yes, our parents are our parents, but we forget that they're individuals in and of themselves, and they have past experiences that shape who they are, and in turn, that shapes how they parent us. And one of the things I wanted to make sure that I didn't do in this book is to just blame my parents or blame parents in general for, you guys messed us up, this is why we are this way. That's not what I wanted to do. Because if you think back to it, they have been parented by parents who maybe have gone through similar things. And that's where that intergenerational trauma and that cycle comes in. The thing that I wanted to focus on through this book is that we have identified a problem. There is a taboo, there is a stigma, and there's also a lot of folks that are dealing with mental health issues that don't talk about it. How can we openly start discussing this, and how can we start moving forward and be better for the next generation? Like, that is my focus, is identifying that there's a problem, and then in making sure that this next generation has the tools, is equipped with the understanding of what mental health struggles can look like, and how we can be better for our children and for the future. Because you can look at the past all you want, but it's only helpful to look at the past if you're going to change your future actions because of it.
I also think it's that Buddhist concept, right? The only constant is change, right? So starting that change is identifying the problem. And once you do that, and you can put words to it, I think we're already making a change. So I think that's really powerful in what you said.
Hi, thank you for organizing this event. My question is almost threefold, but the gist of the question is, have you personally found an answer to the question, "Log kya kahenge?" On a personal level, like what will people say? And the reason why I ask is I want to know a little bit about if you had any experience while you were writing this book with the Islamic Center communities. because you mentioned that, you alluded to that's where we are, we are raised there. So the second part is, what was the experience while you were writing it? And the third part is, in terms of going forward, are you doing any kind of outreach work at that level, at the community roots level, to help the next generation through like Sunday school or anything along those lines? Thank you.
Okay, let's address these one by one. So your first question, have I kind of personally come to terms with this little gathering? I think that, and I say this having written an entire chapter on this, it's much easier said than done. There are still times when I will not do something, not say something, because I'm like, oh, it's low gathering, what are other people going to say? But I think even just releasing this book and talking about it and being vulnerable has been my answer to low gathering. Is that, keep talking, like this is my experience. I'm going to share my experience, whether the low of the people like it or not. And I'm willing to kind of, put my neck out there so that other people can see that I'm doing that and do the same. And I think a lot of times what you need to do against low gathering is come out and have other people supporting you. So if I'm out here and I want other people to join me, by being the first to take that first step, I'm able to kind of convince other people and maybe reassure them that it's okay to come out and share your story, talk about your experience, so that we can change this low care behavior concept. And then going back to doing outreach and even having connections with the Muslim community. So the only bit of kind of connection I've had with the Muslim community is just my own friends and family. I'm originally from Southern California, so a lot of my friends and family there have purchased this book, read this book, but apart from that, I haven't done any formal outreach or anything like that. That being said, I am very interested in the future in sort of building a movement and some sort of momentum off of this book. I think that the first part is to make sure that we're getting people to read this book, talk about it, and then I think in a few years we can actually get to a place where we're able to formalize this as parts of Sunday school curriculum, or even just conversations that people have in religious community centers and cultural community centers, and kind of make this become an everyday part of life instead of something that is this like big scary thing that we did one session on at one time. So if you have any ideas, I'm definitely open to hearing them.
I'm from Southern California. So
Oh, great. Okay.
I'll hook up with you later.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to share a bit and then also ask a question. So how there's a stereotype that South Asian immigrant moms love Princess Diana. So I was on.
True. That's true.
It's pretty universally true. So I was on Twitter and I saw this post that really resonated with me, and it mentioned that maybe a lot of South Asian immigrant moms can relate to the experience of being isolated from their families and then mistreated by their husband and in-laws. And it was just a profound moment for me as I reflected, with my relationship with my own mom and patterns that I see with my South Asian friends that they have with their moms in terms of, confiding a lot about their life to a degree that might not be healthy for kids, for example. So I was just wondering what patterns you found during your research about South Asian moms specifically, and then what led you to title your book, Letters to My Brown Mother.
Yeah, so actually that concept that you sort of talked about where parents require parenting from their own children is called part of it is called emotional parentification. And I did research on that, and a lot of what that is because what ends up happening is parents let, for whatever reason, dealing with their own mental health struggles, and not being the parent, not fulfilling the parent role. So what ends up happening is that the child is now fulfilling the parent role. And that is often where you get that eldest brown daughter stereotype from, which I'm a total part of that stereotype, where so for example, when I was in third grade, I was writing business letters and memos for my dad. I was happy to do that, but as a third grader, that's not something that you should know how to do. but it's something that I did because that is how I had to help my parents coming to a new country, not understanding,
It's like you were the
technology.
country translator
Yes,
for
yes.
the parents.
We were the sort of representative for our parents to the outside world. If we went to a restaurant, who was going to go inside to get our name written down on the waiting list? Me. So I was old, so there's a lot of little things like that where children end up taking that parenting role. Parents start oversharing their marriage burdens with their children, which you can share your issues or struggles in a marriage with a peer because they understand they're at that same emotionally mature level, but sharing that information and burdening the child with that ends up causing that child a lot of trauma, and that's where the trope of you grew up very quickly, or you're mature for your age comes from, because you do end up becoming very mature and growing up very quickly because you're not able to just be a child. You end up taking on the role of a parent in the family. And I talk about that in the book.
She also asked you why you chose the title.
Yes, why I chose the title. Thank you. So I wanted this title to represent, our generation talking to the previous generations in the sense of saying, like, this is how we felt, this is what we felt, whether you saw it or not, whether you believed it or not, whether you want to believe it or not. This was our experience. So that's where that title came from. Also, it was just a very catchy title.
Thanks, Luna, for writing the book. And I have to say there are no coincidences in life. I'm here with my daughter today, and I'm just visiting her for 4 days from California. And believe it or not, I am a South Asian psychiatrist who has been in practice for 30 years.
Wow.
And when we saw, thank you. And when we saw, and so Mira was a student at AU, when she saw this talk today, she called me in California and she says, "Mom, we have the perfect talk to go to." And had I been sort of less confident, I would have had other things to do today. But here we are. And so I just wanted to share with you, my experiences of living in Northern California in a very, very Southeast Asian populous city. And the experiences I've had over the years have not just helped me grow, but helped me maneuver the dialogue to have with South Asians when they do come in for treatment. And so I've seen such a variety of people coming from young kids to parents. And what I've realized is that parents just don't have the vocabulary to talk about these issues. They're hurting and they're in pain, but they just don't know how to tackle it. So what I do as a practice in my practice, when I see anyone, I always have the family coming. And the first thing I do is sort of try to lighten the burden of guilt and shame that the family carries. That this is really not, the child may be manifesting issues in the family. And I am quick to sort of reinforce to the child that if you take care of whatever the issue is, you are really healing one generation up and one generation down. Right? And so, having that dialogue in a very non-judgmental way in this community is so critical. And so, as somebody had talked earlier about what do you do to really sort of, throw these seeds into the community. You don't know what's going to take. So how I do it in my community is I've never turned down an offer to talk at, on the mental health committee of a couple of the high schools that are predominantly Southeast Asian. And I'm happy to talk to parent groups. I'm happy to talk to PTAs. And so when I initially started talking to the students, what I could hear, in my naivety of having come from India now 30 years ago, I would look to them and say, talk to your parents. And they would look at me askance and they would say, they don't get us. And it took me some work to really sort of, bridge that gap for me and my children to give them the vocabulary. And so when I see a Southeast Asian male in my practice, it's really tough because I have to first give them the words to talk about distress and emotions, and then help them through whatever it is. So, for example, last week I saw an Indian male executive who has bipolar disorder. And so he called me about 4 times after the appointment saying, can we not put this anywhere in my medical record? Can we not talk about this with my wife? Because she's going to use it as ammunition against me. And so, the kind of challenges are so unique, and I'm so glad that you've written this letter on this book. And I hope it really sort of captures a wider audience and makes a difference. And so what you've done, I hope, is sort of heal yourself, through it. Because oftentimes, as Mira will tell me, that you cannot change where you've been, but you do control where you go.
Exactly.
And so good luck to you, and I'm so proud of you.
Thank you. That's exactly the point of me writing this book, was that making sure that we can focus on healing the next generation and ourselves. I think that is so important and just immensely necessary for where we are today. There's a few more questions. You in the back.
First off, thank you so much for all the time and energy you've invested into this book. I'm really excited to read it. So I'm a psychology PhD student. I study in Minnesota, and I am here just for 4 days with my friend Lolly. So
4 days.
I know. I was like listening to you, and I was like, wow, this is like there are no coincidences, right? So I really appreciate everything you've been saying, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how, when you think about the South Asian community within the United States context, how do you think things like racism, discrimination, Islamophobia contribute to this hesitation for us to seek mental health care? So things like, Asian Americans are often seen as a model minority. Is there any pressure for us to uphold that, right? And also when we go into therapy or we're seeking professional care, those things like racism and Islamophobia and discrimination extend to the healthcare system as well. So are we then just going to be stereotyped and misunderstood and being, seen as like, okay, here's like one more South Asian person coming from an oppressive, patriarchal community, right? Like all those labels all at once, just because of the way we look like. So I'm kind of curious, we've talked about the family and community level. How does that systemic level in the U.S. sociopolitical context today contribute to this whole discussion, or maybe even complicate it?
Thank you for that question. So I kind of picked up on 2 different parts. So the first one in relation to the broader status of being an immigrant. So that's something I touched on in one of the letters, as well as the setup of the book, talking about how we even got here and how that has a lot to do with the way we deal with mental health. Because, Asian Americans are noted as that model minority, and that means you can't mess up. You don't get a second chance. You have to do this because our parents, left their home, left everything they knew to be here. So this is the only chance you get. That's sort of the mindset that we grew up with. And that is not only difficult to manage as a child, but also even as an adult, so as the parents that have come here. So as a child, I talk about the specific in the chapter titled Poster Child. You become this sort of poster child to what your parents kind of need you to be, because it's seen as there is no other option. So you really have a hard time as somebody who's this third culture kid finding your own identity and finding your own voice, because you're always somebody's daughter, or we were the one brown kid in school, or whatever it is. And that's something that I personally struggled with as well. I think I didn't really come into my own personality until the end of college, because the beginning of college I was really just figuring out how to be a person away from home, and then really I was able to understand my own self and understand my own personality and who I was when I was about to leave college, and that's already 21 years of age. So there is a lot, like a big delay. I used to say I'm like 5 years behind everybody in that sense, because I really didn't have the opportunity to develop that identity when I was younger. because of a lot of those issues. The other question you asked was around the healthcare system, and I touched on that as well, in the sense of when I was in undergrad, there was one therapist for like 2,500 students, and that's not nearly enough. That made it very difficult to, even if you wanted to prioritize your mental health, to actually do something about it. And that is very disheartening because you're like, oh, I tried this thing, it didn't work, I'm not going to try that again because it was not a great process to go through. So that's a huge hindrance. The other thing that I shared my own experience in here on therapy was I remember sitting in the office of a therapist talking to the lady about, I made a comment about how, every time I go home, my mom is always pressuring me to like go on these dating apps to find a man. That's been really frustrating, et cetera, et cetera. And she stopped me and she said, well, that is so wrong of your mom to force you to get married. They can't do that to you. It's like, okay.
The therapist didn't know about rishtas.
I was like, no one's forcing me. She is encouraging me a lot to do something that she feels is important. She's not forcing me. There's no gun to my head. But it was really hard for me to explain to her the whole process of what a rishta is, which is a match, what that dating and finding a match for marriage even looks like as a South Asian woman. And after that comment, I was like, I don't think I can be a patient with you anymore because it's very difficult for me to explain. I can't spend 3 sessions just giving you backstory on who I am. Maybe now I can just like give it a bug. I
did that with my therapist. I was like, here you go. Now we'll talk.
But before that, there is no cultural competency in therapy. I will say though, throughout the process of writing this book, the past few years, I've noticed a lot more South Asians in PhD programs, in these programs. So I would hope in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a lot more culturally competent practitioners out there that can help us with a lot of these unique cultural struggles that we deal with.
And I think also to touch on the systematic thing, I see that as well. And I think the only answer to that is time. You being in the PhD program, you being a psychiatrist, you talking about outreach in the communities, all of those things are, like you said, the seeds that you throw out there to build. Systematic change also takes time, and it also comes with a lot of like heavy hitters too. So I think that's the challenges we face as well, and political climate and all of that stuff too. So we're trying. This is a start.
One more question here. Oh, okay, go ahead.
So I'm just wondering, like from the book and from the interviews, do you think South Asians have it harder when it comes to like somebody who has grown up just in South Asia, been there all their life, compared to somebody who has moved here, has that sense of family unit, and at the same time also have that individual unit, the US sense?
I would say that they both struggle in very different ways. Yes, being here, we have a sense of independence that you may not necessarily have back in South Asia. But as I talked about, there is this kind of culture clash. Like you are the weird kid at school. Your parents consider everything to do with America not good. So you have to be like, we are brown, we're different than the rest of everybody else. And there's a lot of reconciliation that you have to go through on your own identity, on who you are as a South Asian, as an American, or Canadian, whatever. And then add another layer onto that, your religion, your gender. So there's still a lot of issues on this side, but on the other side of the water, there's a lot of other issues with culture as well. That culture that our parents brought over from there is still present over there. And so there's still a lot of issues there, especially because there it's much harder to talk about it. It's much harder to do something about it. If anybody has seen the show Indian Matchmaking on Netflix, one of the girls was referred to, or one of the guys I think was referred to a therapist, but they called it a life coach. And that was very fascinating to me that, he was living in India and they couldn't even say that he went to a therapist, he went to a life coach. And so there's still a lot of the stigma that they're fighting over there. Here is a different type of struggle, but struggles all around. Go ahead. You're next. Sorry.
So we talked kind of about like your intergenerational trauma. Through your interviews and I mean, I guess your personal advice, what is your biggest piece of advice to get kind of the older generation to go to therapy? Because obviously I feel like they've been through a lot, right? I think it's very healthy for old people of any age to go to therapy, but even though it's much more accepted with our generation and maybe our parents are coming around to it, they're not coming around to the idea of themselves going to therapy. So what would be your biggest piece of advice to encourage older people?
Yeah, still struggling with that, but I would say one of the chapters in the book is titled Difficult Conversations. And one thing that I spent a lot of time doing was having this conversation with my family, with friends who maybe that's not something that we would talk about normally, and just normalizing this. So often, every time I would go home, I would bring up therapy. Even the simple phrase is, my therapist said, when I would say that in the beginning, my parents would be like, oh. But now it's a lot more normal for them. So I would say, number one, normalize it, talk about it as much as you can. And it won't be easy in the beginning. It's a hard conversation to have. It is emotionally taxing. So do it as much as you're able. But it's something that really makes a difference. Even just me writing this book, like I had said, makes a huge difference. And then the other thing that I haven't yet tried, but something that I have been thinking a lot about is, as you mentioned, is bringing the family in to go to therapy together. Taking that first step is very hard, especially when, the first session in any sort of therapy is that intake session where it feels like you're just here telling your life story. And it's a lot to feel like you're saying out loud, especially in a culture where talking about these things is not very much allowed ever. So those are the two things I would say to that. And then we have a question right here. In the orange.
Hi. So thanks for welcoming me. I haven't checked it out, but I'm really excited to. And I sort of had a comment about the South Asian thing. So I've been born and brought up in India, moved here around 4 years ago, and my experience with mental health has been so completely different from South Asians and South Asian immigrants. It's been like the polar opposite. It was easier for me to talk to my parents and community at home than it is here. And I don't know why, but I've sort of felt that comes from just like immigrants who moved here, especially single families, are trying to hold on to some part of culture, and that kind of exacerbates what's wrong in the communities in the first place. And the question that I had was, so you mentioned like Bollywood movies and stuff, and how do you think of like the newer age Bollywood movies and shows? For example, Never Have I Ever has been very popular, which has like the entire segment of her going to the therapist and talking all those things out. So what's your opinion of like how much of an impact have you seen personally, and how much do you think like these media outlets affect the whole vibe?
Yeah. So first of all, I would say you're totally right. One thing that I talked about was that when our parents left, they packed up all of the culture that they knew, put it in their bag, brought it here. And that culture doesn't exist anymore back in South Asia. It does not exist. It's interesting because when I would go back as a kid growing up, they would consider us to be backwards, as they called it. They thought we were fobs because we did things differently. They moved on over there, but our parents, the culture that they brought with them was the only connection they had to home in some cases, and they held on to it for dear life. So in some senses, they have made a lot of strides there that we haven't been able to make here, to your point. The second question on the media and the representation, I would say in the past 5 or so years, we've had major representation for different types of South Asian, but I think there's still a long way to go. Yes, we're not like Apu and like the taxi driver anymore, but there's still so many more nuanced experiences and so many more stories that we have to tell. even just, like the 6-7 letters that I wrote in here, those are all coming from totally different experiences. So it's great to see the representation that we have in the media now, but I think that there's still a long way to go for not only South Asians on the screen, but South Asians off screen, telling these stories and talking about these experiences. So I'm hopeful that in the next 10 or so years, the media landscape looks very different than it does today. There.
I think this is also the time to have your mom and dad. And mom, I don't want to be a doctor, engineer, or lawyer. I want to write shows and write a book.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here and so wonderful to hear from California.
Thank you. What was that?
My question was about the process of interviewing individuals, specifically how did you navigate the environment of interviewing South Asian women compared to men in terms when it came to mental health conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was able to do all of my interviews over Zoom, and that made it a lot easier because I was able to connect with folks that didn't necessarily have to live here in Washington, D.C. So that was a great added bonus. My interview process, I started with about 4 or 5 questions that I wanted to touch on at some point during the conversation. And other than that, I left it pretty organic. I would start off by telling them my own story to kind of bring a little bit of that psychological safety and be like, I'm willing to share my own story with you, promise them that anonymity, and then be like hopeful that they will be able to be vulnerable with me about their own stories. I think with men, I realized I would ask a lot more questions because that's an insight I did not have. I asked a lot more about how they grew up, especially if they had siblings, what that dynamic was like, especially if they had sisters, because that's not something I ever had insight to. I don't have any brothers. I don't really have cousins that are my age. And so I was very fascinated hearing that experience that you may hear on TV or people talk about, but really hearing it from people that this is their experience was really great.
Thank you. I was just wondering if there was anything that you learned new about yourself throughout the process of interviewing everyone and researching for this book, because of course you came in with an idea from your own experiences, but I was just wondering if there was some kind of realization that you had about yourself through the process.
Yeah, some of the anecdotes that I shared, I actually realized those during the process of writing the book. It's like, oh, that's why I do that. We're like, oh, that's why this happened. So it was really fascinating, as you said, that this was sort of something that healed me as well. I think another thing was something that I talked about wanting to do, but not really kind of knowing how to do it, was setting boundaries. And that's something I did a lot of research on and did just a lot of work in therapy on. And so talking about it, writing about it, that's something that I was able to implement based off my own advice that I had researched in my own life. So it was really helpful to kind of do the research, something that I had been putting off, but this book sort of forced me to kind of confront that and come to terms with some of that and do that research.
We have a comment from online and a question. The first comment is, thank you so much. Your story definitely hits close to home. Appreciate you sharing.
Thank you.
Then
Thank you for tuning in.
the next question was, how has your book writing journey impacted how you navigate mental health conversations with other minorities of color?
Yeah, so oftentimes if I'm not talking to a South Asian person, I refer to this book as talking about mental health in immigrant communities because I found a lot of similarities, and I guess there's a lot that has to do with our own South Asian culture, but as I said in the beginning, our South Asian culture is a collectivist one, and many other cultures, African culture, East Asian culture, Middle Eastern culture, have a lot of those collectivist tendencies. So often a lot of these things are easily relatable to those who are immigrants as well. So much of this is applicable to that. Maybe not the Bollywood references, but a lot of people watch Bollywood actually.
Priyanka Chopra and Quantico, right?
Steph, I think you had a question here.
Okay, so I'm gonna take you down memory lane just because I can. You talked about not becoming a person, not feeling like you didn't really become a person until college, and we did the undergrad together. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about like what in college I guess flipped for you, and like what helped you change into like, you know, becoming more of an individual instead of a collective. And then two, when you were in undergrad, did you ever think that you would be on stage in the nation's capital talking about salvation mental health or anything like that?
No. When I was in high school, somebody in my high school wrote a book, a novel, and they were featured in our yearbook. I was like, that is so cool. So for the longest time, I had a paper bucket list that I would carry in my wallet, and I wrote that on there. I was like, I want to write a book someday. And I just forgot that I had ever thought that, and then suddenly when this whole thing came out, I was like, wow, I actually accomplished that goal that I don't even remember setting. But in terms of what in college shifted for me, I think it was a few things. One, being diagnosed with depression. And that was the second semester of my freshman year. So pretty much all throughout college, that was something that I was navigating. But it helped me come to terms with a lot of things that I felt in high school and couldn't really pinpoint or understand what I was feeling. The other thing was being away from home. And I know my mom is not going to like me saying this, but that I think was the best way for me to explore my identity. As I've said before, you know, you're, especially as a daughter and the oldest, you're always at home, you're always in relation to somebody, right? You're your parents' daughter. And with that, there's a lot of expectations that come with that. So being, albeit I was like 100 miles away, and my parents would make me come home every weekend, even just during the week, I would be able to learn about myself, what I like to do, what I didn't like to do, how I like to do things. You know, I didn't always have to wash dishes the same way I saw it being done at home, even little things like that. So being away from home really helped me kind of come to terms with my own identity. And then I had the privilege to study abroad, and then I was literally in another continent, and I actually did a semester here in Washington, D.C., where I used to come to Busboys and Poets every Tuesday for an entire semester, and I never thought I would be actually standing here up on stage, so that's kind of full circle. But all of those experiences of being on my own really gave me the opportunity to learn about myself and learn who I am. It's like meeting a new person, and I was able to do that, kind of having a little bit of that distance and that space to grow.
We have another question online. I'm curious to know how your male audience reacted to some of the accounts that were fueled by the patriarchy featuring Lokia Kahing, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, that mentality in relation to women.
The question is for the audience?
How your male audience that's read the book, I think, has reacted to those things.
Gotcha. Even in my interviews, I had folks that, male folks that I interviewed, talk to me about the experience that they had with their sisters and their mothers. And often, you know, they would agree, especially when I talked a lot about that toxic masculinity. That is the same side, that's the other side of the coin as that patriarchal gender norms. Like that's where that toxic masculinity is coming from. And so they were able to understand and relate because, you know, having that experience from their siblings and seeing their mothers go through it, in my experience, they were able to understand the comments or whatever experience that I was sharing, they were able to relate to or understand that.
Thank you so much for this. It's been a pleasure listening to you, especially sitting next to my own daughter. I'm a brown mother, guilty of many of the things that were mentioned here tonight. I would also say, as was mentioned, that I, even now, but I think I started in the beginning of my being a mother, right? I really didn't know how to talk about it, right? But over the years, I don't know how effective, but I have made efforts progressively more, right? And my hope is that most parents are doing this in our community. So I was just wondering, you interviewed people across ages. Have you seen this? I hope you will say yes. And it's so what kind of barriers are parents still feeling, or what could they do?
Yeah, during my interviews, I did see that. I did see parents saying that this is something that they do try to talk about. And the goal of this book is not to say, parents, you did wrong, you're guilty of X, Y, Z. It's identifying that for whatever reason this happened. And it's not anybody's fault. There's so many different factors we can talk about. We can talk about immigration, we can talk about racism, we can talk about culture. There's so many things out of our control that created this entire situation to be that nobody's really to blame. It's really about making that effort, like you said, on trying to kind of bridge that gap, doing something different, changing the perspective and the minds of people. And I would say for parents, again, it's the same thing about talking to your children. I think I've gotten so much closer with my own mother, talking to her about these things and hearing her own experience and her perspective. Somebody that I interviewed used to work in an intake or an inpatient facility, and they talked a lot about the older brown women who would come in as patients and how those experiences that those women were sharing helped them understand their parents better. So I think it really, bridging that gap and that divide is about having the conversation. Because even if that other person is trying, you don't know that they're trying until they tell you, like, hey, this is why I have decided to do this differently. Because I see you and I'm trying to make a change here. So that's what I would recommend, is having that conversation with your children and being open to hearing things that may not necessarily be comfortable hearing on both sides.
If we have no other questions, I actually have a question. Okay. I really, really enjoyed. Hi everyone, my name is Cecily. I'm the program coordinator. I helped put together this event. And
Please, a round of applause.
I really, really enjoyed this. It's honestly one of my favorite events I've had so far. Don't tell anyone. But I really related to so much that you've said, and I find it so interesting how even as a brown person from a different culture, there are things that are similar. Of course, there are specifics to each culture that will be different, but even things that you mentioned, like the older brown daughter, and how we become like parents in our own ways to our parents and our younger siblings. And I just wondered if you've had a lot of conversations with people from different cultures who could relate to the book.
Sorry, could you repeat the last question again?
I was wondering if you had conversations with people from different cultures who did relate to the book, to these kinds of things as well.
Yeah, I have had conversations with people from different cultures, mainly East Asian cultures, Hispanic cultures, a lot of those immigrant cultures. They do have a lot of these similar cultural things, as well as that sort of situation that's been created by your status as an immigrant. So there's a lot of similarities there. I remember back a few years ago, I lived in Buffalo. My roommate, she's Mexican American, and she would say like, oh, like my mom does X thing. And I'd be like, oh, my mom does X thing. And we realized our cultures were essentially almost the same, the Mexican culture, the Pakistani culture, except her culture was in Spanish and mine was in Urdu. So there's so many similarities between our cultures, and that translates to a lot of the issues and the struggles with mental health, the taboo, the stigma, even like the low kahenge, like that, that doesn't go away.
Hey, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Can we please have another round of applause? This has been absolutely fantastic. fantastic. Thank you for gracing our stage. Thank you. It's always wonderful to see fresh faces, especially after, things have been on Zoom all the time. So it's nice to see people. Please drive safely. I encourage you to come and buy the book. As you can tell, it's very good. So yeah, thank you once again, and everybody have a good evening.
I will be signing some copies, so please buy signed copies. Would love that. And a big round of applause for Brenda for moderating.
Thanks for doing it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.